my name is 𝑫𝑰𝑽𝑽 from Rio Grande, Zacatecas. I welcome you to studying the lesson in its English edition. Let's learn together this week's memory verse. Be strong and very courageous. Be careful to obey all the law my servant Moses gave you. Do not turn from it to the right or to the left, that you may be successful wherever you go. Joshua chapter 1, verse 7. God bless you.
The book of Joshua opens with a chapter that not only marks the transition of leadership from Moses to Joshua but also establishes the thematic framework of the entire work. This beginning is not merely narrative but profoundly programmatic. It contains within itself the keys to understanding the unfolding of the story. Joshua 1, with its 4 main speeches, not only reflects Israel's historical steps but also conveys the spiritual demands that accompany each stage of God's people. The emphasis on verbs such as cross, possess, divide, and serve reveals that the life of faith is not static. It is dynamic, progressive, and requires both divine intervention and human response. Israel had to recognize that their entrance into Canaan was the result of God's promise and power, but also that they were called to take their part through obedience and commitment. The structure of the book of Joshua, announced from this very first chapter, underscores an eternal principle. God initiates, leads, and secures the victory, but his people must respond with active faith and practical obedience. Just as Israel was commanded to advance toward the promised land, we too are invited to walk in God's promises, responding with faithfulness and service. Welcome, my name is Augusto Palacios, and this is Studying the Lesson. Monday, September the 29th. Cross, possess, divide, serve. Joshua 1 opens with the divine command to cross the Jordan, Joshua chapter 1 verses 2 to 9. This first movement symbolizes the need to leave behind comfort, cross the boundary of the familiar, and enter into a stage of renewed dependence on God. Crossing the Jordan was not simply a geographical challenge but a spiritual call to trust in the divine power that opened the way. Thus, the crossing represented the beginning of a life marked by faith. The second section, tied to the verb possess. Joshua chapter 1, verses 10 and 11, emphasizes that the inheritance promised by God had to be taken decisively. The land would not automatically fall into their hands, they had to move forward and conquer it in the Lord's power. To possess meant to take hold of what God had already given, remembering that divine promises are not theoretical but realities to be embraced by faith. The third aspect, divide, Joshua chapter 1, verses 12 to 15, anticipates the moment when the conquered land would be distributed among the tribes. This division was not merely administrative but deeply theological. It showed that God was fulfilling his covenant and that every family of Israel would have a place in the divine inheritance. The distribution revealed justice, care, and purpose, reminding us that God's promise extended to all his people with no exception. The fourth verb, serve, Joshua chapter 1, verses 16 to 18, lays the foundation of the entire experience in Canaan. Israel had to understand that God's blessings were not for self-sufficiency or comfort but for living in obedience and service. The commitment to follow Joshua as leader reflected the deeper principle: submission to the Lord and willingness to fulfill his will. This structure in Joshua is not only historical but pedagogical. The people had to recognize that although God's promises are sure, they require a concrete response of faith and obedience. God acts first. He gives the land, opens the way, secures the victory, but the people must walk, fight, divide, and serve. It is a dynamic of grace and responsibility, where human faithfulness is the natural response to divine action. The text also reminds us that the possession of promises is not automatic. Just as Israel had to enter and conquer, we too must live actively in faith. Salvation is a gift of grace, but it calls for a transformed life that obeys and responds. It is the same idea expressed in Revelation chapter 14, verse 12. Faith in what God has done leads to obedience that honors Him. Joshua 1 also teaches that service to God is never limited to a moment. To cross, to possess, and to divide were steps toward a greater goal. To serve. Everything received was to become a platform of obedience, worship, and testimony. This principle holds true today. Every blessing we receive must be returned in the form of a consecrated life. Finally, this chapter shows us that the center of Joshua's leadership was not his skill but the Word of God. The repeated exhortation to meditate on the law day and night, Joshua chapter 1, verse 8, affirms that spiritual success does not depend on human strategies but on faithfulness to God's will. It is in that faithfulness that true victory is found. In conclusion, Joshua 1 reveals that the Christian life is built on the dynamic movement of crossing, possessing, dividing, and serving. Each stage is sustained by divine initiative and requires a human response. Just as Israel was called to live in obedience in the Promised Land, today we are also called to walk in faith, take hold of God's promises, and live in a service that glorifies His name. Don't miss our daily questions on Facebook, Instagram, Threads, and X or Twitter. Every day, Sunday to Friday, we post 2 reflections at 2 p.m. and 8 p.m. to strengthen our learning together. Your participation and comments make a difference. We look forward to having you with us.